everyone, this is Marika and I welcome you all to this new session of Nursing Management with me. In our previous sessions, we have discussed about disaster, the different types of disaster. We have also discussed the role of a nurse during the time of disaster as well as the psychological impact of disaster on different age group. In this session today, we are going to conclude the disaster and disaster management topic wherein we are going to discuss about disaster manual. So let us see in detail what is a hospital disaster manual and what does it consist of. When I say the term hospital disaster manual, we can understand that it is a manual or it is an instruction that is to be followed during the time of disaster. To put it into very simple terms, a hospital disaster manual is a written plan of what is to be done during the time of disaster. It is a plan which is written down to be implemented during the time of disaster in each and every hospital. In hospital disaster manual, the statements are written down, and according to the statement that has been written down, which is pre-planned before the occurrence of the disaster, those steps or those statements are followed during the time of disaster. It may differ from one hospital to another. Now moving on, let us see what does a disaster plan consist of. The very first thing it has is an introduction. So what comes under introduction in disaster manual plan? So the introduction part of the disaster manual consists of a brief synopsis of the plan, which means it gives a brief description about the plan, and it also contains the code that is to be activated during the time of disaster as well as the general code of conduct to be followed within the hospital during the time of disaster. So in the introduction, we have the alert code, which means at the time of disaster, the code, when it is read out or when it is given to the healthcare employees, they should understand that there is a certain disaster and they should prepare themselves to receive the victims of the disaster, to provide medical assistance to the victims of the disaster. So the first thing we have in the introduction is the alert code. Along with the alert code, there are certain code of ethics that are to be followed by the employees working within the hospital, which is also included in the introduction. And the introduction also consists of a brief synopsis or explanation of the entire plan. As the code is given to the employees, or when the alert is given, all the personnel working within the hospital must be alert and they must report to their duties immediately. Anywhere when a code is given, it is given to signal something. So in the disaster manual plan, when the code is given, it means that the employees must understand that there is a disaster that has occurred and they should report to their duties immediately as well as start carrying out their assigned jobs. The second thing that the disaster manual has is the distribution of responsibilities, which is the most important thing. Alert is given, a code is given out. The employees have also reported to their duties, but they have to also carry out the assigned task. Therefore, distribution of responsibilities to be carried out during the time of emergencies when mass casualties occur is the most important part. So distribution of duties are also written down in the disaster manual. The duties and the responsibilities to be carried out by each and every individual as well as the entire department will be written down on the action card. So action card commands the employee to perform the action. The action card in turn will have the detailed description of each and every responsibility to be carried out by the individual as well as by the department. In the introduction part, brief explanation of the disaster plan is given, the code is initiated, people are expected to report to their duties. The second thing we have is the distribution of responsibilities, wherein each and every individual will be provided with an action card which gives a detailed explanation of what is their assigned responsibility. The third thing that we have is chronological action plan. Whatever actions are to be taken by all the healthcare employees must be listed out in a chronological order. The first thing that is to be done is to initiate the alert, and the alert is usually initiated from the emergency department through telephonic calls. And sometimes in case of man-made hazard, it may also be initiated through police and other higher authorities. Once the alert is given in the hospital to all the employees, what are the employees expected to do? The employees, as soon as the alert is received, must gather the information about the type of casualty, about the time and place of casualties, so that the number of casualty can be estimated. Once the employee understands the type of disaster that has occurred, the employees, the hospital workers, the healthcare workers can predict the kind of emergency services that will be required, as well as they can also estimate the number of casualties that may report to the hospital. The second thing that is done in chronological action plan is activate the hospital plan. As we have seen, every hospital will have their own action plan, and immediately after the code is received, they initiate the action plan. While the action plan is being initiated, all the people working in the hospital, all the employees gather to the place where they can receive the casualties. They also predict the number of casualties that can be seen, and also once they estimate the number of casualty that can be seen, they also discharge the patients with minor cases in order to ensure that there will be enough space to attend the victims of the disaster. Patients with minor cases may be discharged in times of disaster so that the victims of the disaster can be accommodated, or else the patients with minor cases who still requires the treatment can be transferred to other hospitals. And finally, we have management of casualties. Once the alert is given, the personals are all ready to receive the casualty. The victims arrive to the hospital and the victims are received, and then the casualties are managed. In management of casualties, it involves collection of further information about the patient, about the disaster that occurred, and also providing proper treatment according to the need of the patient. We are already aware that during the time of disaster, triage is to be followed properly so that every victim of the disaster is provided with the required medical assistance. That is all about disaster manual plan. Moving on, let us see what are the managerial issues that are seen in disaster management. Have a look at the screen right here. You can see that we have a table wherein we have written the concepts and the description of the concept. The very first managerial issue seen in the hospital is the clinical type. In the clinical issue, we see that in times of disaster, we've already discussed that many hospitals do not follow the triage system, and since many people arrive to the hospital at different times in casualty, non-serious patient may demand for attention because they arrive to the hospital first before the serious patients during the time of disaster. If the patient arrives to the hospital first, even if the patient is not with some serious injuries or serious problem, the patient will demand for attention, and the healthcare workers in the hospital will not be able to classify the patient according to triage. That is the first issue that can be seen during the time of disaster. Not just classifying the patient according to the triage, but also sometimes the nature of the disaster may not be known by the hospital employees. So these are some of the clinical problems that can be seen during the time of disaster management. The second type of issues that can be seen at times of disaster is administrative issues, which includes documentation. At times of disaster, because it becomes very chaotic, there is a chance that the documentation will not be maintained properly. Therefore, forms that are previously structured are to be used during the time of disaster in order to ensure that we save our time. Documentation and forms related to various medico-legal cases also must be kept ready, because at times of disaster, these kind of cases may also be seen. Another administrative issue that can be seen during the time of disaster in hospital is communication problem. As I said, during the time of disaster, it becomes very chaotic. Therefore, proper channels of communication are to be kept ready. The means of communication such as telephone are to be kept in order, and also additional lines can be used with restricted phone numbers in order to receive priority messages. We are already aware that communication is a key during the time of disaster. Therefore, communication is to be maintained throughout in order to ensure that the casualties that are being received, the medical assistance that is required by the people is provided, as well as in times of shortage of drugs or equipments in some ward, through proper communication, all of those things can be arranged. Being a healthcare worker in the hospital, when we communicate with others, we also must maintain a logbook in order to make sure that messages are written down and documented properly. Another issue that can be seen in the hospital at the times of disaster is friends and relatives of the patient. Now, the patient's family members, the friends may be anxious, they may be stressed out because of the disaster as well as what has happened to the patient. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the healthcare workers to ensure that time to time information, the update about the progress in the patient's health must be given to the patient's family as well as friends through the information booth. In the hospital, a list of patients with their location in the ward can also be displayed outside for the relatives and the friends. As we know, many people will be in the hospital in times of casualties. Relatives and friends may visit the patient and they might not know the location where the patient is admitted. And therefore, they have to come and ask about it, inquire about it to the people working in the hospital. And so, to avoid such kind of problem, a list of patients can be printed out and it can be displayed with the location of the patient within the hospital. Another problem that can be seen is crowd control. As we have been discussing that there can be huge crowd in the reception as well as in different wards within the hospital at times of disaster because the victims are brought in by family and friends. Therefore, crowd control must be done at times of disaster. In order to control the crowd in such times, the authorized person with a proper visiting pass can only be allowed to visit the patient. The next one that we have is involvement of voluntary workers. So from the time we started discussing about disaster, we have seen that voluntary workers or relief workers play a great role to help the patient during the time of disaster or to help the victim at the time of disaster to provide the required basic facility as well as to help them reach out for a proper medical treatment. Within the hospital as well, during the time of disaster, we may see that there are voluntary workers working for the welfare of the patient. So it is a role of the hospital administration to decide whether the voluntary workers are required in the hospital and what will be the roles and responsibilities that will be carried out by such workers. If in case the voluntary workers are not required within the hospital and the staffs are able to manage the casualties received, it must be told politely to all the voluntary workers that whenever they will be required, they will be called for assistance. The next issue that can be seen is the issues in blood donation. Usually when there is a disaster, we see that large number of people rush to the hospital in order to donate their blood for the people who are in need. So blood donation camps are to be arranged by the hospital administration as and when it is required. Usually, large volume of blood is not required until and unless we have a disaster such as bomb blast, riots, etc., wherein there will be more surgical injuries which requires more blood to revive the patient. So blood donation activities are also to be managed by the hospital administration in a proper way. Camps must be arranged because people rushing to the hospital in order to donate the blood will also create problems within the hospital. The hospital may become overcrowded. It is the responsibility of the hospital administration to organize blood donation camp whenever it is required. Usually at times of disaster, we see that many number of people rushes to the hospital in order to donate the blood. Even though it is a good thing that people are coming forward to donate the blood for the victim, but this may create chaos in the hospital. It may become overcrowded and the hospital workers may not be able to handle the crowd. Therefore, proper blood donation camp can be conducted in order to collect the blood as and when it is required by the victims. The next problem that can be seen during the time of disasters is donation of food, clothes, medication, etc. At the time of disaster, even though people come forward to donate the food, cloth, drug, etc., it must be controlled and regulated. Several times during the time of disaster, it is also seen that because of uncontrolled distribution of food, the food also goes to waste. Whereas there are some number of people, some number of victims who are not provided with food. Only when it is properly controlled and regulated, each and every victim will receive the required amount of food as well as clothing. Another problem that can be seen in the hospital is issues in patients' properties. At the time of disaster, the patient may have different ornaments, the patient may have different jewelries that the patient comes to the hospital with, they may have their phones with them, and there can be different types of stuff that the patient may have which is important for the patient. Therefore, it is necessary to collect all the items that comes with the patient in a big polythene bag, and also put an identification tag in each of the patient's bag in order to make sure that the articles of the patient are separated from the other patient, and also that it will be given to the respective patient or the family members. The next one that we have is press and broadcasting. Now, there should only be one person from the entire hospital management in order to address the media or the press. The updates related to the patient, the updates related to the management being provided to the patient, if it is to be released out in the press, from the hospital side, there should be only one person who gives out the press releases. When there are many different people giving the statement on the same thing, which is the status of the patient or the management that is being provided to the patient, the update on the progress of the patient, this may lead to confusion. If there's only one person who gives out the press release, it will avoid confusion as well as it will avoid misleading the lay people. The next one that we have is ambulance services. Now, ambulance are required the most during the time of disaster to transfer the victim from the site of the disaster to the hospital, or to transfer the patient from one hospital to another. Therefore, ambulance are to be kept in proper working condition. It should function properly. Additional vehicles and vans can be arranged in order to make sure that the required number of vehicles to transfer the patient is available. Another issue usually seen during the time of disaster is not having emergency lights. So during the time of disaster, we see that there is damage to the physical infrastructure as well. Therefore, it is obvious that the electric supply may also be disrupted to the hospital. And in hospital, in the triage area, in the treatment area, proper emergency lights are to be arranged so that the care that is provided to the victim is not disturbed. Continuous electric supply is to be maintained, as we know that in hospital to run many different equipments such as X-ray machines, to perform procedures in the operation theatre, emergency lights are required. So continuous electric supply must also be maintained during the time of disaster in the hospitals. The next one that we have is disposal of dead bodies. During the time of disaster, there can be many deaths that may occur, and therefore the dead bodies must be disposed properly, as at times of disaster, the mortuary in the hospital may not be able to cope up with the number of dead bodies. So we know that mortuary is an area in the hospital where dead bodies are kept, but during the time of disaster, the number of death may be increased, and therefore the mortuary will not be able to accommodate all the dead bodies at the same time. Therefore, prompt disposal of dead bodies must be arranged by the hospital during the time of disaster. And finally, we have the visits of the patients, family members, the relatives, and also the VIP visits. It is always advisable to avoid visits in the hospital during the first few days of the disaster, as it interferes with the work of the hospital as well as it brings more security problems. So the visitors must be restricted, even if it is a VIP visit, or the visit made by the patient's relatives must be restricted in order to make sure that the continuity of the care is maintained. During the time of disaster, not just in the hospital but also to the affected area. So that is all about the managerial issues in hospital during the time of disaster. Let us move on and see disaster plan and the principles of disaster plan. We have already understood that a disaster plan is there in each and every hospital, no matter the size of the hospital, whether the hospital is a small hospital or a big hospital. A practical plan to be followed during the time of disaster is required, and every hospital has a disaster plan. The disaster plan may include the coordination, cooperation, and the responsibilities to be carried out by medical professionals during the time of disaster. It may require the medical professionals to also develop certain special skills in order to address the need of the disaster. With a proper disaster plan, a timely preparation of the plan and implementation of the plan will help the hospital to save a lot of money, and not just the hospital but also the patients. So additional cost can be added to the patient, additional cost can be there for the hospital if there is no proper disaster plan. In order to avoid such kind of situation, a proper disaster plan can be made by the hospital. Let us now discuss the principles of disaster plan. The very first principle is to mobilize the manpower within a short notice period. So we are already aware that we will not know about the upcoming disaster. The disaster occurs suddenly, and within the short notice period, manpower must be mobilized from the hospital, maybe to the site of the disaster, as well as inside the hospital where more manpower is required. For example, maybe in casualty department. Therefore, manpower mobilization is the very first principle of disaster plan. Many different hospital workers will work inside the hospital in different wards, but at the time of disaster, every patient may not reach out to the ward directly. There may be patients will mostly come to an emergency department initially. Therefore, more number of people are required in emergency than it is required in special wards or in other different wards. And so, mobilization of the required manpower within the short notice period is the very first principle of disaster plan. The second principle is to have a predefined and a prepared site with the required infrastructure. Every hospital, to address the need in times of disaster, must have certain infrastructure, and therefore that infrastructure must be properly planned and it must be readily available in all of the hospitals. The third principle is delegation of competencies, which means delegation of responsibilities to each and every employee so that the employee, as they receive the alert code, can immediately initiate their work. The fourth principle of disaster plan is to ensure that the routine hospital activities are also not disturbed during the time of disaster, and all those routine activities are carried out properly. And finally, the last principle of disaster plan is to make sure that the resources are available and it is also utilized in proper way. Moving on, let us see the types of disaster plan. There are mainly two types of disaster plan, which is the external and the internal disaster plan. Let us first see what does external disaster plan include. The very first feature that should be included in the external disaster plan is the alarm. So we have seen that the first thing that is done at the time of disaster, and finally making sure that the resources are available within the hospital as well as the resources which are available are utilized in proper way, is another main principle of disaster plan. So that is it for today's session. In this session today, we have discussed about the hospital disaster manual, hospital disaster plan, and also managerial issues that can be seen in the hospital at the time of disaster. I hope the class was helpful, and I'll see you all in the next session. Thank you and have a great day ahead.